One Punch Man is one of, if not my absolute favorite piece of media I have ever seen. The animation is gorgeous, the score is full of banger after banger track, the vast majority of the characters are charming and likable, and it's generally an amazing deconstruction of shonen and superhero tropes. And I'm very glad I started keeping up with the manga, because now when I make that claim it means I don't have to specify just season 1. I poke fun at season 2, but I do still like it. It's definitely not on the same level as the first though, which is why I wanted to make this video only talking about season 1. This is going to be a laid back video where I watch and talk about my favourite season and my favourite show. No real guidelines to go over, whichever ones I like better for whatever reason go higher. I'm also not including the OVAs because why would I? The Silver Fang vs Saitama one's the best one of those anyway, the ending to that one's one of the funniest things in the series to me. Not much to say other than that, so let's not draw this intro out any longer and get started. And also hope to God I don't get copyright struck, that'd be preferable.
Seaweed, 50% sea, 50% weed.
Episode 6, The Terrifying City. This one's kind of the inverse of the one that came right before it. Episode 5 had a solid enough first half boosted up by a phenomenal second half, and episode 6 has a phenomenal start which is weighed down by a less interesting second half. I wouldn't say the stuff with the kelp monster is bad or anything, it's still solid. Some side characters getting to shine is neat, and the collateral damage of Saitama's punch sparking a rumour about an even more dangerous monster is pretty funny. But as a whole, I can't say I'm invested as these side peeps as much as any of the main casts, or even other better side characters introduced later down the line. The monster doesn't leave nearly as much of an impression as other minor antagonists with even less screen time. I don't know, it just isn't as interesting to me as basically anything else the season has to offer. The first half of the episode is what I'd find myself going back to more often because it's excellent. The opening bit where Saitama feels like he's scamming Genos by being a shit mentor with nothing to teach him, and then the spiel he makes up on the spot is comedic gold. I like Saitama frantically running around town trying to find a bad guy so he doesn't get kicked out of the Hero Association, and then he's somehow oblivious to Sonic being a bad guy for a good few minutes before he finally takes him down. Speaking of which, I think this is actually my preferred of the two Sonic confrontations. The added context of Tank Top Tiger thinking Saitama's just some weirdo running around scaring people, and that being what Saitama's more concerned with is pretty damn funny. It makes Sonic seem way more insignificant, and he seems to realise that as well, which leads to him being a much more unhinged lunatic, and it's great. He's fully willing to blow up an entire street just to get Saitama's attention, and it still takes a bit for even that to work. I also like Saitama chomping into the sword. That's almost as amusing to me as the ball punch from the last Sonic encounter. Yeah, this episode doesn't have especially much going on to talk about as much as I enjoyed it. Even if I'd only go out of my way to rewatch stuff from the first half, I would still happily rewatch the whole thing whenever. I loved it overall, and the fact that I can say that about even my least favourite episode should say a lot about what's coming up.
Noodles. Don't noodles.
Episode 5, The Ultimate Mentor. This one really peaks with the Saitama vs Genos fight. This shit is so well animated it blows my mind. And despite one character doing nothing but evading the entire time, it still manages to be really exciting. Then of course there's the Death Punch, the first taste of what Saitama can really do when he cuts loose. Not only is the punch well animated and intense, but the build up to it is equally fantastic. I'm amazed at how well they can convey Saitama taking things more seriously by only slightly leaning forward, not even showing his face at first. I also love him speed blitzing Genos pretty much instantly, but he's still able to process the death punch in slow motion. That's great. I love the Udon challenge as well, showing that Saitama can still be outdone in areas that aren't physical strength. And even though Mask isn't one of my favourite characters or anything, the music during his talk with Genos does really well at creating a sense of unease around him, even though he's not actually doing or saying anything malicious. The first half of the episode isn't quite as strong though, I'd say. Far from bad, I still very much enjoyed it, but the best scenes to me are Saitama smashing every record in the Hero Association physical exams, and him reflecting if this is the kind of hero he really wants to be. The former's really funny, and the latter's another good look into his mindset on his hero hobby. It also has Snack getting laid out instantly like he was Moomin Rider. Love to see it. Other than that, I can't say I was as grabbed by the first half as most other episodes. Snack's seminar isn't especially interesting, neither is the boardroom meeting at the start, even if it does set up for one of the best scenes in the show later down the line. Saitama and Genos reacting to their hero ranks also isn't one of the stronger comedic beats to me. I do like Saitama's reaction and Genos over-analysing it all, but the bit of them only pulling half of the sheet of paper out of the envelope does feel a little more forced than most of their other jokes to me. Still not anything actively bad here, just a few scenes that aren't as strong as others. It's a pretty good first half of an episode boosted up by the second half being phenomenal. If you couldn't tell, I love this show, I really can't stress that enough.
The fuck you say to me?
me, you little shit!
Episode 4, The Modern Ninja. This is the episode that gave us Speed Ascend Sonic being punched in the balls. What else do you really need? Well, I guess the episode could also do with a kick-ass fight scene, which it does have. Sonic vs Hammerhead is pretty damn good, especially the scene with Sonic dodging all the rocks being chucked at him. I like how Hammerhead only survives the encounter because he's that literally thick-headed, and that even comes back in the very end. The Saitama vs Hammerhead stuff is also pretty good, even if it is ultimately just 3 attacks being thrown between each side. I can't say this is one of the more fitting uses of the super triumphant sounding Saitama theme, but it also sounds great, so I can hardly complain. I like that the one attack he uses to end things this time isn't even a punch, it's just a light elbow nudge that still shatters Hammerhead's suit to dust. Saitama's following scuffle with Sonic is also pretty well done, with easily the most iconic scene in the episode. Other than that, this episode is really at its most interesting when Saitama realizes the similarities he has with Hammerhead, who's entertaining but not an especially standout antagonist otherwise. I quite like the self-reflection Saitama has at the end where he wonders if he might have ended up like Hammerhead if things had turned out differently. The realization he has that no one knows him also sets up for the next arc well, while getting a chuckle out of me with how his face is drawn. Moomin getting the credit for the win is a little strange when he got floored in one hit and there were witnesses of that, but Moomin getting a W is still cool, even if I wish his introduction took up a bit more of the episode than it did. As it is right now, it did kind of feel like everything else was done and he was thrown in at the last second, though him immediately getting bodied between shots is funny at least. Only other thing I have left I can say felt weird about this one is the lack of blood or anything when Sonic is tearing up the Paradisers. All of them are made of the ethereal void apparently. Maybe because it would be too much for them to reasonably air, but given what they've gotten away with in other episodes, I kinda doubt that. This is still a great episode, I had a lot of fun with it. Like I said, it gave us this shot, so how could I not love it? And setting up one of the series' few recurring villains is pretty neat too. Sonic's a funny guy. I like how hyper competent he is normally, and then Saitama just humiliates him every single time.
That is slightly foreboding.
Episode 10, Unparalleled Peril. This is probably the episode I have the least to say about overall, because it's kinda just a lot of setup for the Boros arc. It introduces the remainder of the Class S heroes besides Blast, though the only ones to make a particularly strong impression on me are Metal Bat and Atomic Samurai. Tatsumaki gets to do more stuff after she kinda did nothing in her initial appearance. I liked her confrontation with the Ancient Monster King being more comedy focused than action focused, and her snapping at everyone was pretty funny. The rest of the episode has some solid laughs as well, but it is mainly focused on setting up the threat of Boros and his invasion. They get across the peril of the situation well in their meeting, and establish very quickly that Boros and his crew are not there to fuck around with how quickly they annihilate City A. Melzagard also makes his debut, killing some fodder villains and disarming one of Atomic Samurai's students. And the anticipation it builds for the upcoming fight between him and 4 of the top S-class heroes helps to sell how much of a threat he is, especially with the association's heaviest hitters being elsewhere, so he can't just be taken out immediately. Hurry taking Deep Sea King's advice on combo attacks was also a really nice way of showing that that arc had actual lasting impact on the characters that were involved with it. Yeah, there's not much to this one. It has its funnies, it has its ominous foreshadowing, it does what it wants to do incredibly effectively, but ultimately this is the first third of an arc that leaves little to talk about when standing on its own.
Okay.
Episode 11, The Dominator of the Universe. Same goes for this one as it did for the previous episode. This was a lot of fun, but it's not where the bulk of what I have to say about this arc comes from. The Class S vs Melzagard fight is great despite some slow patches, and I remember my first time watching this thinking they actually went and killed off Silverfang. They actually have a villain that feels like he could kill some important heroes, because there was no chance here of Saitama coming in to bail them out. Saitama running around and tearing the ship apart is also super fun. I like that they offhandedly mention how one of the monsters he killed on board is even stronger than the one currently giving several Class S heroes trouble. And his shit-eating grin when he goes against Gario Gunship's directions gives me life. His following battle with Space Squidward isn't one of the more interesting ones in terms of what actually happens in it, but it's at least got some nice looking visuals, and the anticlimax of Saitama not even punching him but taking him out with a pebble is great. The peak of the episode comes at the end though. I'd say this probably has the best hook for the next episode out of the entire season. Boros giving his best speech as well as actually being the first villain to survive a full-on punch from Saitama sets the stage for what is sure to be the season's best fight scene. And I remember back in 2015 when I didn't think the series would be continuing after this episode, I felt actual tension in thinking Boros was going to be the big final boss that Saitama would struggle to defeat. Of course now I know the story was only just getting started, but it still set the stakes very well for me back then. Oh, and Saitama's reaction to Boros' armor breaking is amazing of course. The whole episode is for that matter, but once again this is merely building up to the big climax of the season.
The animatronic characters here
do get a bit quirky at night.
Episode 2, The Lone Cyborg. This episode gives a great introduction to Genos. The post-credits teaser at the end of episode 1 built up this air of mystery around him, making those who hadn't read the manga wonder what his deal is. Whether he was the one who killed the animals or if he was following the trail of what someone else had done. And this one shows us that it's the latter. Despite his cold metal exterior, he's still just a kid trying to do what's right. His fight with Mosquito Girl gives a good first impression of how strong he is, while also showing off his inexperience. He scanned the perimeter beforehand, but failed to take into account Saitama being there when he made the quick decision to vaporize the bug swarm. The fight also foreshadows what his win-loss record is going to be like moving forward. Though he at least isn't a total jobber, he doesn't care about losing an arm because he uses it as a means to take double the amount of limbs from the big bug, and even makes her turn tail and run until she can get a power-up. Speaking of Mosquito Girl, yeah, I can't really say I'm a fan of her design, but the mosquito she has doing her bidding gives us one of the season's funniest gags of the strongest man on the planet failing to kill a single insect, and there's some pretty gross imagery with all the dried up husks of bodies the swarm leaves behind. Genos' reaction to seeing her go down in one slap is also really funny. The second half of the episode has Saitama reluctantly agreeing to be Genos' master, and his reaction to the cyborg's drawn out origin story is another super strong comedic beat. The humour in this one in general gets even stronger in the second half actually. I love how Saitama takes out the bug man before he's even finished talking. The way he nonchalantly handles Beast King is great, focusing more on emptying the dirt out of his belt than the giant animal threatening him. I love Arma Gorilla dropping the confident facade when Beast King dies, and of course there's this top tier shot. I do find it a little odd that Beast King of all opponents brings out the consecutive normal punches. He feels like kind of a throwaway antagonist to break the usual trend of Saitama only needing one punch, but it sets up the move for the Boros fight later, and I guess it fits better here than in the context of one of the stronger villains later, so it's not too bad. I think the character setup stuff was also stronger in episode 1, though that may be down to me finding Saitama a much more compelling character than Genos regardless. This was still a good introduction to our deuteragonist, and overall a super enjoyable time.
Lord of the Seven Seas, the Deep.
Episode 8, The Deep Sea King. Hey, it's the first of the 2 episodes I talked about in a video last year. Talking about this one on its own feels very weird, because it really does go hand in hand with episode 9 and it is much harder to separate from that one than vice versa for me. But I'll still do it anyway because, I mean, that's the whole point of this ranking. The star of the show here is the titular villain. I talked about him already in that other video I mentioned before, but to give you the Cliff Notes version, Deep Sea King is a great rising threat. He's constantly taking on bigger and bigger threats, taking out 2 A-class heroes with ease, and then taking on an S-class hero with very minimal resistance which he can heal from immediately. Anytime it looks like there's any hope for someone to try and take him down, he starts healing and fighting back harder, or the rain will come on and he'll be back in peak condition when he was previously losing. He's constantly establishing himself as a physical powerhouse, and with Saitama not knowing where he is, it means there are actual stakes with the characters' lives. Though I guess he never outright kills anyone, but the fact that the possibility feels like it's even there makes him feel way more threatening than even some of the villains who are stronger than him. On top of that, he's just a hell of a lot of fun to watch. He's such an arrogant piece of shit and it's delightful. I love that once Puri's done with his Angel Rush, rather than be taken aback or anything, he instead decides to lecture Puri on how to do a proper combination move while he beats the shit out of him. I love the close-ups letting him look more unhinged. I love how he towers over almost everyone to get across how physically imposing he is. He's a great villain overall. He also gets to remind me that Sonic is a competent villain, since he's able to keep up with a monster who even a Class S hero couldn't hold a candle to. The episode introduces Puri as well, who, yeah, I can't say I'm as big on as a character when they play into his worst attributes. Sorry, I don't find Sex Pest to be an endearing and lovable character trait. And I wish the most prominent gay character in the series didn't have that association. Sorry one, that's one of the series' rare L's right there. Thankfully, the episode doesn't play into those attributes quite as much. They get to have actual funny jokes with him accidentally ripping his sweater, and focusing more on him parodying those old magical girl tropes. His brief fight with Deep Sea King is pretty good and tells his strength pretty effectively in spite of how badly he gets bodied in the end. I'll also say that this being the first half of a 2-episode arc means that this is one of the most effective episodes at building up hype for the next one, setting up Genos vs Deep Sea King, while Saitama and Moomin Rider close in on their location. But every other episode before it stands on its own, so that's not really a fair comparison. Overall, a fantastic episode, but the real meat of things will come much later on when I talk about what followed on from it.
Hey, crab cake!
Episode 1, The Strongest Man. Rewatching this one for the first time in years made me remember what got me to immediately fall in love with this show. This is an amazing introduction to our main character and the internal conflict he grapples with. The Vaccine Man stuff sets the stage perfectly for exactly how the rest of the show's gonna be. A generic shonen villain shows up and has a really threatening design and monologue for how he's gonna destroy the world or whatever, and Saitama swiftly takes him out in one shot with some really nice looking animation. The Saitama origin stuff that follows it is even better, not just with Crablanti being a funnier villain thanks to his stupid-ass origin story, but with it showing us exactly who Saitama is at his core. Someone who's willing to put himself in harm's way to protect others and has a real passion for being a hero. Even though he logically knows he should stay out of Tamato's way for his own sake, he has the heart of a hero deep down. Plus it gave us one pretty solid fight scene with one of the most rancid but fucking awesome displays of gore in the series. Getting to see that fire in Saitama's eyes, followed by it hard-cutting to his current day apathy, is great at setting up what his mental state's like nowadays. As is the internal monologue when he kills the car dude. That scene also gave us the debut of my favourite music track in the series, so there's that as well. The Attack on Titan dude also has a pretty good arc for as brief as his screen time is, having achieved his goal but becoming emotionally distant pretty quickly, just like Saitama. And as humorous as the scene is, I actually kinda felt for him when he accidentally killed his brother. Saitama just standing and letting him continue his destruction is a little weird, but that's really about the biggest issue I have with the episode. So most of the episode is super enjoyable, but I think the peak of it comes at the end with the Subterraneans. The fight Saitama always seeks is so well animated and is actually fairly tense. I'm sure my first time around I probably thought that they would be the main villains of the series, and that Saitama would actively be seeking them out, because the way they actually put up a fight and claim to have killed 70% of humans on Earth sets them up as a legit threat. But of course it's revealed as a dream sequence. A usually unsatisfying story trope which works perfectly here given Saitama's dissatisfaction with his overwhelming strength. He gets his hopes up that his dream was a vision of what was to come, but the Subterraneans folding immediately was honestly the funniest part of the episode to me. First episodes rarely, if ever, grab me like this one does. It sets the stage wonderfully for the rest of the season, and it reminded me exactly what it was I loved about the show after having not watched through it from beginning to end for so long.
Let there be carnage.
Episode 3, The Obsessive Scientist. This one follows on from where the last episode left off incredibly well, with Armored Gorilla giving exposition on the House of Evolution, and Saitama once again getting fed up with an incredibly long-winded explanation. Also, one of the most underrated jokes of the season is Saitama misinterpreting Genis' interest in his body as him being flirted with. That's funny right there. This is the first episode of the series where the entire episode focuses on one specific plotline, rather than having a handful of shorter stories in one 22-minute package, and I think that did it a lot of favours by letting it be as fully fleshed out as it needed to be without dragging it all. The start is solid enough. I especially like how they set up all these traps Saitama and Genos will have to make their way through, only for Genos to nuke the whole building and for Saitama to be a little disappointed. And Genos is fine as a villain, but the star of the show here is Carnage Kabuto. They convey this dude as one of the most threatening villains of the season with how unhinged he is and how effectively they portray his power. The third strongest creation from the House of Evolution was already able to give Genos a good fight, but Kabuto takes Genos out with little more than a few casual backhands and breathing really hard. The fact that he's set up as such a powerhouse and he's got this massive ego makes him backing off in pure fear from Saitama even more effective. His bravado disappears in an instant and is replaced with pure terror. This of course leads into the great bit of Saitama explaining his workout regimen and no one in the room believing him. It is one of the most famous bits of the season for good reason. Carnage Kabuto seeing it as a lie leads to him going Carnage mode, and this was easily the bit of animation that impressed me the most up until this point in the show. I love the new look of the room, and the entire Carnage mode rushdown looks fantastic. I also remember me being worried for Saitama when I first saw this back in 2015 because of his internal monologue. But then that gives us one of the best comedic payoffs where he one-shots Kabuto and is more worried about missing the sale at the supermarket. The comedy in this episode is some of the best in the series, honestly. I found myself laughing really consistently despite knowing a lot of the punchlines beforehand already. And even when they aren't actively telling jokes, the fact that Saitama showed up through a single punch and made this guy give up on his decades of scientific research is absolutely golden. I really only have good things to say about this episode. It's amazing. Though Carnage Kabuto kinda needs to put his tongue away, not gonna lie, was that's kinda rancid.
It's not just a boulder, it's a rock.
Episode 7, The Ultimate Disciple. Wow, I can't believe it. All these villains with actual personalities and lots of effort put into the designs up until this point in the show were outshined by a rock.
Except you stay.
Jokes aside, after the season was getting gradually weaker and weaker with each passing episode, this one kicks things back into high gear and is in my opinion the best one up until the point it came out. There really isn't much to this one. The first half shows a meteor approaching Earth and the second half deals with the aftermath of Saitama smashing it apart. And like I jokingly implied earlier, this inanimate rock ironically ends up being a bigger sticking point to me than a lot of the villains with actual fleshed out characters. They build up the threat of it super effectively by bringing up its dragon threat level, and by showing even some of the toughest S-Class heroes failing to put a dent in it. The scene where Saitama comes in and smashes it is also just stunningly well animated. Genos' full power blast before was fantastic, but this right here is on another level. The wind up to the punch and the sound effects sell the impact so damn well, and the blue explosion that follows it is really pretty looking. That doesn't stop all the collateral damage, of course, which means the big rock has one of the biggest lasting impacts out of all the antagonistic forces in the season, and I find that very amusing. These repercussions lead into the second half where we actually get to see how people are coping with the destruction of their city to an extent, which was something missing from previous city destroying events outside of a few offhanded mentions. This time around it's the focus of the episode, and it's what these two assholes use against Saitama to try and crush his morale by turning the public against him. I love how hilariously petty the Tank Top brothers are, and how badly Tank Top Black Hole folds when Saitama grabs his hand. And while there are a handful of really funny jokes like Saitama's old apartment surviving but not his favourite supermarket, the highlight to me here is the character drama stuff. That's where I think the series tends to be at its best after all. And here we get Saitama boldly declaring that he doesn't care if people admire him or not. He does the hero work solely because he finds it fun, which we know to be somewhat of a lie. I mean, he seemed pretty interested in people admiring him, and was fairly disappointed when he realised he wasn't a well-known hero. But he stands his ground. He lets everyone know that he's the one who smashed the meteor, and that anyone who has a problem with it can just count themselves lucky they're even alive. While the Tank Top brothers couldn't match him physically, they still got in his head and made him snap, something that doesn't happen particularly often. Though Genos is luckily there to pull him away from everything, and they share a really nice exchange near the end. Saitama tells Genos not to butter him up, but when he turns back around, you can see him smiling. So clearly Genos' words had an effect on him, and he did appreciate it. It's a fairly minor scene, but it put a smile on my face as well. This is more or less a perfect episode to me. It hits the mark in every way I could want. Actual stakes with both physical danger and reputational damage, all with jokes thrown in for levity that don't feel like they kill the tone completely. It introduces new and fun characters including my goat Silverfang, the emotional beats hit, the animation is some of the best in the series. It's top tier on all fronts. Love it, love it, love it.
Finally, a worthy opponent. Our battle will be legendary.
Episode 12, The Strongest Hero. What a finale. For a while I would have probably called this my favourite season finale to any show I'd ever seen, but the Quirky Frog cartoon just had to go and surpass it. Twice.
Oopsie whoopsie.
Don't let that take away from this episode though. I mean, it's my second favourite episode of my favourite show, goes without saying that I adore it. The opening scene shows a brief snippet from Saitama's fight with Boros, building the anticipation for the rest of the episode. We gotta hold off on that though, because there is another ongoing plotline that needs to be resolved, and it's thankfully dealt with right away than constantly cutting from the main event of the episode. And yeah, they beat Clayface, Silverfang survived and I cheered, good stuff. But this obviously isn't the main draw of the episode, so let's talk about the actual highlight. Saitama vs Boros is what I would call by far the best fight scene in the entire season. The speed and intensity of every single attack is sold incredibly, with the best animation the show has ever seen. Even stuff like Boros smashing through these pillars looks incredible, let alone stuff like the meteoric burst and moon kick, which I am still to this day blown away by how smooth they managed to make it all look. They even bring back the consecutive normal punches which was set up earlier in the season, except this time it actually feels warranted to use. I also appreciate that they have Boros never shut the fuck up, which gets Saitama bored listening to him after the start of the fight left him thoroughly unimpressed. But even he's taken aback by the meteoric burst. Selling Boros is by far the biggest powerhouse of any antagonist in this series, and that's before he kicks Saitama to the moon and almost nukes the entire planet. The serious punch Saitama takes him out with is also amazing, finally giving us our first real showing, even more so than the death punch, of what he can really do when he isn't actively holding himself back. I mean, the shockwave of the punch nullifies a planet-destroying laser, then takes out Boros, and then continues to part the clouds all the way around the Earth. That's so fucking cool. Even that doesn't kill Boros though. He's out of commission, but he's still just barely clinging on to life briefly. As he remarks on how tough the battle he always wanted was, Saitama agrees with him, but Boros can tell that he was lying. He held back for the sake of giving him the fight he sought after for all those years. It's not something that he needed to say outright, which is why he doesn't do it, but you can tell that Saitama sees himself somewhat in Boros. Their stories parallel each other, with their strength leading to unending boredom. Maybe Saitama even thinks of him like he did with Hammerhead, wondering if he would have gone down Boros' path if he'd made some different decisions in his life. Regardless, he knew he could lay him out in an instant, but he sympathizes with Boros and chooses to fulfill his life's goal first, giving him that exhilarating battle that he always dreamed of. An extra touch I really appreciate is that right before the collapsing star roaring cannon, we get a parallel to the dream sequence in the first episode. That fight scene had the whole thing with Saitama's heartbeat to show him finally getting his dream fight, and we get to see the same for Boros here. There's another shot earlier that similarly matches the dream sequence, with Saitama standing up to fight his greatest battle in the midst of a fire, but in that one he was getting a good fight, while here he's just kinda disappointed. And that disappointment carries into the scene following the serious punch. Saitama finally found someone that could withstand a normal punch with him, but went down as soon as he started trying for real. Boros got the fight he always sought, but Saitama didn't. Even the prophecy that threatened the Earth couldn't give him that fight. I don't know of any other piece of media that can make the hero triumphing over the villain feel this hollow and unsatisfying, but for it to work tremendously in its favour regardless. There's more to the episode after that, but it's mainly setting up Mask as kind of an asshole, and building more suspicion on Metal Knight, who rebuilds the Hero Association HQ. Also, Genos gets bodied after all the villains are already defeated, and that's hilarious to me. Post-credit scene is good as well. We've come full circle since episode 1, with Saitama once again being upset at a powerful villain going down in one shot. This is such a good episode. Easily stands out as one of the series' best with how they handle Boros, who I wouldn't hesitate to call the season's best villain. It works for me in basically every way to an extent so few other shows can match. Outstanding doesn't even begin to cover how I feel about it. And yet, there's still one more episode that I like even more.
Where'd the fish go?
Episode 9, Unyielding Justice. This is it. This is the pinnacle of the season for me, and one of the top contenders for my favourite episode of any show I have ever seen. This not only closes out the Deep Sea King arc perfectly, but it pays off things I didn't even know needed paid off. The episode opens with Genos fighting the Deep Sea King, which is about as well animated as you'd expect, and feels like it could genuinely go either way. Genos has the firepower to take out the big fish, but him dropping his guard leads to him losing an arm for the rest of the battle. But he still keeps up, landing some good attacks on Deep Sea King and even matching him in raw strength. It looks like Genos might emerge victorious for once, but Deep Sea King is able to exploit Genos' heroic nature and make him jump in front of a glob of acid to protect a little girl. This leaves him as a disgusting looking husk which gets easily trounced, and the only reason he even survives the encounter is because of Moomin Rider showing up to distract Deep Sea King. Between the two of them, Genos definitely had the more exciting and dynamic fight, because he was the only one who actually had a proper fight at all. But honestly, I prefer Moomin's attempt to stand against the Deep Sea King because it is a much stronger character moment. It was offhandedly mentioned in a previous episode that he refused to move up to B class, something I never took note of before, but this episode has him explain how he knows he's not worthy of moving above class C. He knows he's too weak, he knows he'd be out of his depth, but right now that doesn't matter. Win or lose, all that matters is him taking a stand to protect the innocent no matter the risk. He's getting absolutely destroyed, he doesn't stand a chance and he knows it, but he continues to get back up. This scene also has no music for a lot of it. It's just Deep Sea King tossing him around and beating him down with only background ambience to fill the silence, and it's fucking heartbreaking. The crowd is on Moomin's side at least and cheers him on. They really had me going that he'd be able to do literally anything, that he would stand even the slightest chance. But he gets beaten in a single punch. Right as the music reaches its peak, right as the crowd of people is given one sliver of hope, he's taken out. Which is funny for like half a second, and then the reality of their last line of defense being defeated sinks in. Thankfully, Saitama shows up, takes the monster out in one punch. You all know the drill by now. It cuts to the next day where Saitama gets what you think will be fan mail, but turns out it's some guy with too much free time telling him that nobody likes him. And that's when we get more context to the aftermath of the battle. With how easily Saitama won, it makes the other heroes look really weak in comparison. And the civilians begin to lose their faith in some of them. Their donations keeping the association running are also brought up, making it seem like the organization might be in some danger. But Saitama overhears this and makes it seem like he intends to hog all the credit for all the work done by those other heroes. Throughout the season, Saitama's shown that he cared both about protecting people and about being at least somewhat well liked, but here he shows that he's more than willing to sacrifice his own reputation for the greater good. What seemed like it might have been his chance to finally get some recognition has now been turned completely against him, but he doesn't care because he knows it's the right thing to do. And much like with Silverfang in the Meteor episode, they give an actual reason for why Genos doesn't immediately step in and bail his master out of trouble. This scene is my favourite in the show. For as good as everything to do with Boros is, and as fitting as it is with playing into Saitama being the greatest hero that nobody knows, this works even better for me by actually giving him a crowd to have react to his actions, and having more consequence on him in the future. character. There is more to this episode afterwards. Saitama moves up to B class, Mask is told about everything that happened, Hori has to reflect on his own reputation going down the drain, but it is overshadowed hard by everything I just finished talking about. There is one last scene though that puts an even bigger smile on my face than more or less anything else in the show. Moomin revealing himself to be the one that sent the thank you letter earlier, and treating Saitama to a nice dinner as a thanks for saving his life. We get a nice little flashback of the two bonding, and the scene as a whole is just really sweet. Helps that they're my two favourite characters in the series, thanks in no small part to this episode showing that they're both truer heroes than anyone else in the association. With this having my favourite scene in the show as well as two others that are incredibly close, I have no qualms calling it my favourite episode of the series. Hopefully it keeps going at least to where the manga's at right now, because if it can properly adapt the most recent chapters, I don't doubt that I'll eventually have a new episode that I can call my favourite. And with that, I've covered every episode of Season 1. Maybe I'll do Season 2 as well someday, but don't count on it. There are other shows I would much rather cover instead. Thank you all for watching. This series is very special to me, so it means a lot that people are willing to hear out my inane ramblings on it. This has been the most fun I've had writing a video for my channel. Getting to rediscover why I fell in love with the show was a blast. So I hope you've all enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it. Now this is the part where I realise I still don't know how to properly end videos, so I'll probably just have it cut off halfway through this